In part 6, I want to illustrate the SSE case study using a community forestry project in Malaysia, where there is a strong people's participation in the implementation of SDGs as well. Next. Now, SDG and community forestry is a key component because of sustainability. Yeah? So community forestry and sustainable forest management. And this case study brings out the close connection between community and land, especially among indigenous people and community forest users, or people living in the forest or in the fringes of the forest, where land is a very important and significant aspect of their identity. Now, this is especially so in indigenous people. Indigenous people in Malaysia who are forest-based live on the peninsular side, as well on in the Borneo Island of Sabah and Sarawak, where there is a lot of contestation over land ownership and acquisition of their land by private sector companies with political connections and so forth. So the right of forest-based users is quite an important aspect. And this is linked to inclusive democracy. It is linked to gender balance, on social justice. But definitely areas of conservation, biodiversity, water sources, sustainable tourism, conflict with wildlife, human and wildlife conflict issues because of the encroachment of human beings into forest areas, but also looking at the forest and developing it in the context of livelihood and generating income opportunities. And many of the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, in this context are relevant, such as SDG 10 on inequality and discrimination, which is an important context and concept on inequality and discrimination, whether it is economic, social, and so forth. SDG 15 on the sustainable use of forest is an important point. SDG 16 on peace and justice is also important. And SDG 17 on partnerships is also very important concept to recognize. Next. Now, the project is located in Sabah, which is on the northern tip of the Borneo Island. Of course, Indonesia calls this Kalimantan, which is west, east, or central. And we know that the Indonesian capital is moving to East Kalimantan in the next few years. But this project site is on the tip, which is in Sabah. And you can see Malaysia, Sabah, and the close proximity of Sabah to the Philippines and so forth. Next. The hill and the indigenous land is actually is Gumantong Hill, which is inhabited by a particular native community called Runus. So this is in the Kudat Sabah part on the northern tip, and this is an indigenous community. This land is over 590 hectares of forest on the hill, and the height and the hill is surrounded by 13 villages with about 3,000 people. And the villages are about 40 to 200 houses in the village. in that area. But what is significant is that the 13 villages at the foot got secured customary ownership of the mountain and the forest, which they then protect in a collective way. Next. Now, land identity and contestation is central. The natives living on the land had no land titles because it was customarily owned. But then the land was gazetted first as a forest reserve, and the people didn't know it. So when it's categorized as a forest reserve, then they might not have access to the resources of the forest or access into the forest. And most often the forest is then protected by rangers and so forth. But the people protested and made representation, and the state government of Sabah de-gazetted that forest reserve and converted it into a community heritage land, land to the people as a heritage and as a community land. And this is a very significant departure in which the people, through a people movement, because the general elections were coming, and they used it as a major political tool in that context to secure their political right in that context. Next. Now, so the people power, or the people movement for collective demand and the exercising of their democratic rights won the day, and they managed to secure the land as a community trust and reverse the state policy on the land. Next. Now, they formed a committee. Of course, if you see the committee, I visited them because a close friend of mine on my left is Dr. Paul Purundo, who is a Runus himself and an anthropologist working in this area, who introduced me to this hill and the local community. Here you would see there is a need for gender balance in the leadership, because all the village leaders at this point are men. But the village is full of women who are very dynamic as well. So the village has, the land comes under the 13 villages, and they have a trust, and they manage the forest together with guidelines for conservation, protection of water sources. There is some collective agreement for effective community projects in this context. So there is this common value of seeking to have income generating projects through this community trust that they have set up. But there is a very strong commitment for conservation of the hill, because of the water sources, because of the biodiversity, and the villagers take a collective commitment to protect that mountain space and to keep it as environmental friendly context. But it's the support of the community and its ability to turn the natural resources to economic well-being as well. Next. So it's largely, these are poor communities because poverty and low income are major issues. The Pitas area is one of the poorest districts in the whole of Malaysia, and there are various locations in Sabah. But this village took on community-based socio-economic development projects. So it's largely villagers undertaking community-based socio-economic activities of income generation in order to improve their income source, complementing agriculture or other things that they are doing through micro and small business development, using the land and agricultural resources in that context. Next. So some of the community features, so if you see on the right-hand side, there are 6 different micro business, and the details were in my report, like nature walking, walking up the hill, where they use guides, young people in the village. There was the bird's nest, the swiftlets, and income generating, because there is a lot of insects where these migratory birds come to lay their eggs, and so forth. And what is of commercial value as a delicacy in China is the nest that these birds build using liquid that they spit out, and the eggs are then hatched, and then the birds, the baby birds fly off. But the nest is valuable as a delicacy and largely exported to China. Gong making, bee and honey, because bees are in the forest, wild, or in more cultivated bee honey sort. Beads making, which is more traditional. Ecotourism, because of the mountains, some waterfalls, homestay program. So there are 6 different forms of micro businesses. Each village took on one kind of project. So it was the government trust of one village, one product. So while it's run individually, each family doing production, but there is a collective marketing aspect through the community, and also in the way they have established access into the village and the resources. So the micro business complements their agricultural work in that context in a significant way. Next, please. Now, the nature walks, young people, school, youth come, they have to pay for the walk up, and that's something that is significant. Bird's nest, as I mentioned, they build these structures where the birds, which is the bird's nest soup, which is a delicacy, and it generates a lot of income in that way. Next, please. There is the village economy, gong making, which is a traditional one. There is the bee and honey. So the women run this shop where the women take turns, and each family has their own production and their logo, but the sale and the shop outlet is a collective one that they take turns. Beads making in one of the villages, the ecotourism in another one is likewise very significant. So these are the multiple type of projects coming out from one big community of people linked with the mountaintop, as it were. And this is well researched and documented in Malaysia, and I have picked up the materials from it. Next. Now, in this, we see the 5 core principles: people, profit, prosperity, planet, environment, governance, and values. This is the lesson emerging from this case study. The income generation for common good is something that is coming out. There is tremendous potential in the use of the land and agricultural resources for the poor. Because the poor took control of the forest, they are then not isolated from their neighborhood and their traditional sense of identity to the land. And because that is available to them as a community trust, they are then able to utilize it for the common good and keep them in conservation, but likewise in other areas. But the 6 Businesses complement each other, complement the income generation, complement people's livelihood and so forth. There is a strong interconnection between people, people development, environment, and economy. There is a strong conservation element to it as well, which I've highlighted before. Local natives are taking ownership of the forest and the land. And there is a strong inter-community cooperation among the neighborhood, among the natives. So this is very significant in this lesson that comes out, that it's not just income generating, it's not just economic and social, it brings out conservation as a key element in our area of discussion and thought.